Cells have membranes that allow them to establish and maintain internal environments that are different from their external environments. The processes that allow ions and other molecules to move across membranes is the fundamental idea of this video, mechanisms of transport. To understand how things move in and out of the cell, you must first understand the cell membrane. Transport across the cell membrane provides structure for the cell, protects cytosolic contents from the environment, and allows cells to properly function. While the cell wants homeostasis, the phospholipid bilayer acts as a guard for what comes in and out. It is semi-permeable, which means it only allows specific substances to pass through. Because of this, many molecules require a specific structure to get them through the cell. The two main ways for them to do this are through passive transport and active transport. Passive transport is the diffusion of substances across a membrane with no expenditure of energy. One type of passive transport is simple diffusion. This is what we referred to earlier, and it is when molecules move down their gradient through the membrane. That is caused by, again, the cell's desire to be homogeneous with their environment. So when there is, for example, more of the substance outside of the cell, it will move through simple diffusion inside of the cell. Small nonpolar molecules often cross the cell membrane through simple diffusion. One commonly known example is H2O, and when they do this, it is called osmosis. Another type is facilitated diffusion, which is diffusion helped through a membrane transport channel. There are many different types of channels that function this way, but they all serve for specific molecules, thus each having specific functions that correspond. To illustrate this concept, let's look at this illustration depicting the cell membrane. In this image, the green channels are examples of passive transport. The potassium and sodium are moving across the membrane through facilitated diffusion. See how the sodium moves into the intracellular space, the area where it is at its lowest concentration. And then look at how the potassium is moving into the extracellular space. This is, again, moving down the gradient from areas of high concentration to low. Note that there is no energy needed, and they travel through their own specific channels. Diffusion of a substance across the membrane with expenditure of energy is active transport. When molecules need to be moved against their gradient, to do so, this action requires a source of energy. We reference this illustration again, this time looking at the purple pump in the center. This is a sodium-potassium pump, a great example of active transport as it uses energy to move sodium and potassium molecules from low to high concentrated areas. From the intracellular space, 3 sodiums bind to the protein pump and are moved to the other side as ATP splits into ADP and the phosphorus produced attaches onto the site, changing the shape of the pump. After the sodium gets moved to the other side, 2 potassiums will bind due to the changed shape and will be released again on the other side. This process results in 3 sodiums back in the extracellular space and 2 potassiums moved into the intracellular space. Another form of transport important to understand is endocytosis and exocytosis. Here illustrated in this model, we can see that endocytosis is the process of capturing objects from outside the cell by absorbing them into the membrane and bringing them into the cell. Exocytosis describes the process of vesicles traveling to the plasma membrane and releasing their contents outside of the cell. So how can you identify if a form of transport is passive or active? It is important to remember that there are 2 key main differences: their direction of movement across the membrane and whether they require the use of energy or not. Looking at this image, we can see that the glucose moves inside the cell from the outside, which is where there is a higher concentration of glucose. Also note that there is no use of energy necessary for the glucose transporter to move them across the membrane. We identify this as a form of passive transport. In this image, it can be seen that there is a higher concentration of hydrogen ions outside of the cell, and they are being transported against that gradient. There is energy used in this mechanism of transport, as you can see that ATP is necessary for the proton pump to work. This is active transport. Putting this information all together, understanding how these processes work under context is important. Passive transport moves from high concentrations to low, while active moves from low to high. Passive transport does not require energy, while active does. These basic ideas are important to understanding the processes of transport in a cell.